Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to Rare Talks, the role of genetics in childhood rheumatic diseases, put on by Cassie and friends. My name is Sarah Etier, and I will be your MC tonight. I am also a parent of a child with a rare autoinflammatory disease. I thought it was fitting that today, being Rare Day, he's actually flaring, and he missed school, and he missed his school tournament this evening. So first, I just thought I would let you know the format of the session today. We will start this evening with a focus on genetics. We have guest speaker Liz Devins, who will talk about genetics from a parent-patient perspective. Then we have Dr. Ashish Marwaha with a medical presentation on genetics and the latest research. After these presentations, we will have a question and answer. So if you do have a
You muted yourself.
Hey, Sarah, we're not able to hear you right now.
You're muted.
Hey, everyone. So did you hear any of my introduction?
Yeah, you were. So if you do have a question,
All right.
and then you muted. So.
Okay, and then I was muted. Okay, so if you do have a question, you can put it in the chat. Our chat will be monitored, and then we will get to those questions when we do our Q&A session. So just some housekeeping before we start. Please keep your mics muted, and you can keep your cameras off during the opening remarks and the speaker presentations. And the closing remarks. So I'm just going to ask you right now to take a moment and just make sure that everything is muted. Your camera is off. Perfect. If you have any technical difficulties, there is a dial-in number on the registration email or the reminder email that you received the other day. And just a little bit about Cassie and Friends. So Cassie and Friends is a Canadian charity that is 100% dedicated to providing support, connection, education, so sessions like this tonight, and research to the pediatric rheumatic disease community. I discovered Cassie and Friends many years ago through the Alberta Children's Hospital in the hopes of finding support and resources to navigate, what were challenges and difficulties parenting a young child with a chronic and rare health issue. So Cassie and Friends would like to thank their sponsors for making an evening like this possible. So a big thank you to Nicola Wealth Management, AbbVie, Amgen, and Sobi. So today is Rare Disease Day. Many of us here have rare diseases or are the caregivers of someone who has a rare disease. So even though our symptoms and our diseases might be slightly different, we do have a shared experience and we do share similar struggles as we navigate this world. And sometimes this can feel very alone. My family's journey with a rare disease started about 10 years ago, when my son was 5 years old and we were living abroad at the time. And we didn't really know the culture very well and we didn't speak the language very well. As we reflect back, however, this journey started, years before, just with random kind of symptoms and bouts of illness that we always thought, it's just a virus, it's just a virus, it's just a virus. But with time, the illness kind of morphed and changed and it became apparent that all these random symptoms were actually connected, and we were finally referred to the right area of specialization in medicine, which was rheumatology. So currently we are based out of Calgary. We go to the Alberta Children's Hospital, and I'm also a member of the Canadian Systemic Autoinflammatory Patient Advisory Group, CANSED, which is a branch of Cassie and Friends. And this group knows all about this journey with rare diseases, as we are all either patients or parents of children who have rare rheumatic diseases. It's not easy to navigate this world because there's not a lot of knowledge and research and treatment options available. And so we're hoping to change this by raising more awareness, offering education and support, and working to engage patients in research for systemic autoinflammatory diseases. So Ian Stedman and Apurva Vajpayee from CanSet are also here today, and they will be joining the breakout rooms later this evening. So this is a map of who's here today. So we are here from all over the world to learn more about genetics. I thought this was a really nice visual representation of, you know, the different regions and countries and cultural backgrounds that we're from. So I want to welcome you here. This is the biggest gathering of rare disease patients here in Canada to date. You know, this is not an easy journey, and the fact that you are here and you're present and you're trying to learn more to better support someone and be an advocate for them and do whatever you can to help them, that says a lot about you. So thank you for joining us here tonight. And I hope there'll be some takeaways this evening. And you're welcome. I see that it's already started, but you're welcome to go to the live chat and add your location and the disease name so we can learn more about who we are today. So Rare Talks today is part of an education series that's available through Cassie and Friends, their virtual education library. So you can find other recorded education sessions just like this evening if you go to their website. Also from the Cassie and Friends website is the classroom resources, which gives you access to even more information, such as latest research, patient stories, school toolkits, etc. And there is also a private and secure Facebook group called Juvenile Arthritis Canada. So this is a support group for patients, parents, and caregivers. So it is called Juvenile Arthritis Canada, but it also includes many other topics and discussions that relate to other rheumatic diseases. There's lots of upcoming events to learn more about and to support rheumatic diseases. So you can find this information from Cassie and Friends website and through their social media channels. The newly diagnosed the first 12 months is a great information session to learn more, especially during what is a very vulnerable time and can feel quite overwhelming. So we are almost at our guest speakers. So I just wanted to remind you that you can submit a live question in the chat box, and we'll get to these during the Q&A part of the presentation or the session today. Okay, so we are now going to go into our guest speaker presentations. First, we will hear from Liz Devins. So Liz is a parent that knows what it's like to grow up with illness, having been diagnosed with JIA at the age of 7. Many years later, as a mom, her son was diagnosed when he was less than 2 years old. And Liz will share her family's experience of their journey with genetic testing, some of their frustrations, and their findings. So Liz and her family are patients at the Alberta Children's Hospital. This is the same hospital that my family goes to. So I would like to thank you, Liz, for being here today to share your story. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and so that you can start.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. And I just want to thank Cassie and Friends for having me to talk today. So like Sarah said, I had been diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis at the age of 7. My mom ended up in emergency after years of noticing joint pain. And she ended up, like many parents in emergency, kind of unsure what to make of all of it. And that's when I was diagnosed. And we went through years and years of flares, very poor control. At the end of it, the big new drug that that I was put on was naproxen, which is kind of a first line now. I had lots of strep infections, and then kind of as things, I eventually went into remission when I was in my teenage years. But because of the poor control, ended up getting osteoarthritis, and then recently was re-diagnosed as psoriatic arthritis. And so Jason and I are both on methotrexate right now. And then just through all of this, I also had a mom who had like weird autoimmune things. And like at the time, obviously we hadn't connected anything, but fast forward, Jason at 20 months old was diagnosed with a viral infection. I think he had RSV and double ear infection. And then one day in the bath, I just noticed he had a big swollen knee. And I was like, here we go. And they said at the time that it was a reactive arthritis, and that there wasn't really any genetic correlation. He's at no higher risk of having juvenile arthritis than anyone else in the population, which at the time I think was the best information that anyone had. And thankfully we're moving forward here. So we've kind of he's now 9 years old. And we've gone through years of ups and downs. And through most of it, what got me was that everyone said he didn't fit in a box and wasn't presenting as like a typical arthritis or, whatnot. When he was about 5 years old, he was diagnosed with uveitis. And that's when we started on Humira. And that actually connected us to Cassie and Friends, because we started Humira and it was for us a nightmare. Jason, we had to like pin him down to try to inject this medication. He thought it hurt so bad. And I was like, this is just unbelievable. I can't do this. And like speaking as a mom, but also like as a nurse, I was like, there has to be something better than this for my child. So I connected with Cassie and Friends. And through that, they were like, oh, we're trying to get this citrate-free Humira. And as I'm sure many of you know. So that's kind of how like my advocacy part happened, because once the kids were in bed at night, I was writing to politicians. I was ending up in circles and trying to get through all of this on my own. And then all of a sudden I had someone I felt like was supporting me through that as a parent, feeling quite helpless. So we've had kind of this roller coaster of arthritis that he'd be really great and then flare again, often associated with getting infections and particularly strep. During COVID is when we were having recurrent fevers, like fevers for weeks. And at the time we couldn't go to the family doctor because you couldn't go anywhere with a fever. And by I think it was February of 2021, I was completely just beside myself. I think we had close to 20 emergency room visits, and not getting kind of any answers, and this like background of, oh, he's not kind of fitting into things. And we had talked about some of the periodic fevers, and this is Jason. We had talked about the periodic fevers. We had talked about Blau, and at the time he was like having these weird infections where he'd just like break out in hives. He had recurrent strep that wasn't responding. And then we ended up in the hospital after an immunology appointment, oddly enough, where he had been started on amoxicillin, which he'd had many times before, and went into anaphylaxis. So he was in the hospital for a couple of days, recovering from that and trying to figure out kind of
A painful days.
a couple of painful days. It was a little bit of a nightmare. But in that visit, I said to one of the doctors, I said, I can't do this anymore. Like, I just feel like it was a disservice to him that we just kept poking him for blood work and never finding anything out. And so he put in the referral to see genetics, and that's how we ended up there, to try to actually see if it was Blau syndrome or one of the periodic fever syndromes. And we had some really great conversations, and kind of looking back through his infections, going through like his disease, my disease, and there were so many things that were similar. And in doing the genetic testing, it was a little bit frustrating because the government at the time wasn't wanting to fund this. And so they did agree to do a portion of genetic testing that included about 6,000 genetic types. And in that, we found just one thing that was off, was this LRBA. And I was like, well, maybe this is it. And then we looked at this gene, and some of the things were uveitis, rashes, recurrent fevers, arthritis. And I was like, that's it, that's the picture. And it had targeted therapy. And I thought that this was the answer to it. And I called Jennifer at Cassie and Friends, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, imagine this is it, and we can get target therapy and he's going to do so great. And I was like, why can't we offer this to all children? Like, if we can figure out what's causing it, offer them, like, without going through like all these different drugs to trial and error things. And then we found out it wasn't that just recently, and have been waiting to connect with the genetics team at Children's Hospital, and kind of got lost in translation about a year ago when we had found out that the funding had run out. And a year later, I kind of was like, we have to figure this out. Like, is there any way we can pay for this privately? And so we did that, and then got connected yesterday with Dr. Marwaha, and found out that in the background, they had been working with Jason's case and trying to figure out different ways to cover it through research and all kinds of things. So it ended up being kind of a learning experience, and like continuously pushing to like close the loop, communicating with physicians and different people that you're working with. Like, we've got pediatricians, we have Jason's got a rheumatologist, we are working with all different immunology clinic, all these different clinics, and then somewhere the loop didn't get closed, and he got a little bit lost. So So now we're back on track. We're hopefully gonna now get 20,000 genes looked at. And so our genetic journey isn't over. It's kind of, I feel like, just beginning, but we're really hopeful that in the research and all of this, that we're going to find better treatment, and we're going to find targeted therapy for these kids so that they're not going through so much. So yeah, that's kind of
What's targeted therapy?
targeted therapy is medication that works just for you, and they know it by your genes. So yeah, so that's kind of our little story, and I'll pass it back to you, Sarah.
Good answer on the spot. Thank you, Liz, so much for sharing your story with us. There are experiences in your journey that many of us can relate to. I know I personally can relate to the many emergency room visits, the having to give your child painful injections and the stress that goes along with that, and the not quite fitting in a box. So thank you. I find it's really helpful to hear someone else's story, because we can often find shared experiences in that that maybe make our own journey feel a little bit less lonely. I would like to now introduce Dr. Ashish Marwaha. Dr. Marwaha is based out of the Alberta Children's Hospital as a clinician scientist and a clinical medical geneticist. His work is focused on understanding and diagnosing the cause of rare diseases, and ultimately through his work, he wants to improve targeted treatments and therapies for patients like us. Our family is thankful for Dr. Marwaha's work, because he's currently going to be looking at the genetics for my son's autoinflammatory disease. So another connection for my family. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Marwaha, for being here today.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll start sharing my screen just to say it's a pleasure to be here on Rare Disease Day with all of you, and being able to do something to kind of mark and celebrate that event. I think it was also a pleasure to connect with Liz and Sarah again, because they are both my patients, but as they both said, there are many patients and you don't often get to connect and listen to their stories in this sort of format, and it's very informative for us as clinicians to hear the other side of what you're going through, especially if we have contributed to that in any way. So I'm going to talk to you about genetics and childhood rheumatic diseases. My name's Ashish or Ash Marwaha. I am a physician at the Alberta Children's Hospital. I'm a trained medical geneticist. I did a PhD in immunology in Vancouver, so I know some of the Vancouver people. I did my training at Sick Kids in Toronto for genetics, so I know some of the Sick Kids people, and have ended up in Alberta trying to merge those interests with a specialist interest in rheumatic genetic diseases, which are the ones that I see and are referred, but also extending beyond that to immune diseases. And so today I was going to give you an overview of how I think about the genetics of rheumatic diseases. And I think it can be a confusing area for parents and patients themselves, because when we say something is genetic, that can mean a lot of different things, and sometimes you get lost by what that can mean for different disorders. And I would like to try and give you an overview and then talk a little bit about the research I'm doing and how it fits into what we're trying to do in Canada. And this, I'll mention briefly, this CanSAID group that sort of grew out of a discussion with myself and Cassie and friends when we were writing a grant. So I want to get everyone on the same page for genetics, because I think some of you may have never seen clinical geneticists. And so this is what we always say at the beginning of any session. So we show up this slide, and we say that genetics basically is a bunch of instructions. The genes are just instructions for how you grow and develop. So all your genes are in all of your cells in the body. Each cell has a copy of all your genetics, organized into big pieces called chromosomes. When you look inside the chromosomes, you've got the DNA code, and that's organized into discrete regions called genes. I think I think
marijuana.
someone's speaking in the background. If we could just make sure everyone's muted, that'd be great.
Yeah,
Thank
sure,
you.
on presenter mode.
Oh, am I? I can change it. Thank you. Let me change that. Is that better? Okay. So essentially, yeah, so as I was saying, we've got the genetic code in there, the DNA. That's discrete genes are like regions of DNA. The other thing we usually say is that you get half your information from mum and half from dad. So you'll get 2 copies of every chromosome and 2 copies of every gene. And as was mentioned earlier, when Liz was talking about her big test, there's 20,000 genes roughly in the body, of which around 5,000 have a genetic condition attached. So we know for 5,000 of them, when we have a change in that gene and it's not working, we have a condition attached to it, but there's 15,000 to go. So we're definitely not at the maximum knowledge here in 2023, but we're a lot further ahead than we were when we first sequenced the genome, which was only very recently, okay? Sometimes we talk about this sort of being like a library, and the chromosomes are like the books in the library, and the genes are like the sentences in the books, and you sort of read the sentences and they're in pairs, one from mum, from dad. And most of the genetic testing looks for changes in a single gene that cause one of these conditions. And of those 5,000 that have a condition, I would say you're around 600 to 700 in the immune system, and an ever increasing list of ones that are like the autoinflammatory single gene disorders, maybe 50 to 100 now. But that list is growing every month as new ones are discovered. So it's a fast-paced area that is hard to keep up with, and which is why a lot of patients find it difficult, because they're often offered a test and then maybe a year down the line, things will have changed completely and new things will become available, and it's very province dependent. And the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was monogenic versus polygenic or multifactorial disease. So multifactorial polygenic disease is a different entity. So remember I was talking about single genes and looking for changes in a gene that would cause something. Those are the 5,000 conditions. But there's lots of very common conditions that actually involve a different way. They're still kind of genetic, but it's not a single gene that's being caused. There's lots of genes. And so things like JIA or JDM, a lot of the or PFAPA, a lot of the diagnoses that some of your children may have really fall into this category. So they are kind of genetic, but in a different way. And the way I kind of explain this to people is like, you can imagine that you all like have a funnel that you're born with, and filling that funnel above a certain level will give you this condition, this like, say JIA, take JIA as an example. You have to go above a certain level in this funnel to get it. And what we start off with is some strong genetic factors that maybe, you know, if there was a change in the chromosomes or something, or a whole bunch of genes missing, you may be born with that, you'd have a strong factor. But also weak genetic factors. So those are common things that we all carry, like little changes in genes. It can depend on where you're from in the world, and your parents hand you some of that. So you've got a bit of that in there. And then often there's an environmental factor. Now, we don't know sort of clearly what all the environmental factors are for these multifactorial conditions like JA, but they don't happen straight from birth, right? So there is something that happens to you during your life that's going to fill up your funnel more. And as soon as you tip over, you start getting symptoms. But some people might fill up their funnel, like might have their genetics and their risk being low to start off with, but fill up with their environmental things that actually get the condition. And some may start very high, but never get over the level. And so they don't have the condition, right? And so the inheritance is kind of like this. So I'm trying to show in this slide that you could have a mother and father who don't have JIA, and their funnel has been filled in with some genetic and some environmental things, but it never went over the line of the risk. But when they each have children together, they hand down different amounts of risk to each child, right? Because you're getting different things from mum and dad for each child. There's 2 chromosomes you could get. You're getting different levels of risk that are being added. And then each child has a different sort of environmental impact, which are the things in red. So some of their children, so maybe like one child will actually go above the level, like child 1, and will get JIA. 2 of their children could not. And the 4th child, maybe because they were born with, inherited the bigger risk from one of their parents, actually goes above the level. And so essentially, we can get mixes in families, but there is a bit more of an increase in risk when you have a multifactorial polygenic disease. It does run in families, but not in the same way that a single gene is tracking down. It's a number of different, the risk that's coming from both sides. And so sort of to compare that side by side, you've got monogenic, so the single gene things on the left here, and the polygenic or the multi-gene things on the right, where the environmental factors come in. So JIA would be on the right, and monogenic conditions like familial Mediterranean fever or Blau was mentioned are on the left. They're single gene things. And what's the difference between the two? So on the monogenic side, they're usually rare disease, rare changes in single genes. They're not common changes, because if lots of people had it, lots of people would get that. Whereas in the polygenic side, we all carry these changes. Like they're very common little changes along the code that are common. They're not rare, because lots more people have JIA than have a rare form of a genetic condition. There's this concept of autoinflammatory versus autoimmune. Someone from Cassie and Friends, the exec director, told me that this was one of the most asked questions from the website at some point, or how people Google them. So this is just sort of an artificial distinction. What is autoimmune versus autoinflammatory? But in general, the autoimmune things tend to be multifactorial. So JIA is an autoimmune thing. And the autoinflammatory diseases have a more enriched for the rare genetic disorders. What it really relates to is which part of the immune system is self-attacking you. And so they're sort of artificially distinctive, and there is some overlap and crossover there, but that's a generic way of thinking about it. And there's other sorts of autoimmune diseases like diabetes, type 1 diabetes, or SLE, and those sort of belong to the multifactorial side. And then this question of, does it run in families? So on the left, obviously, if it's a single gene change, it could either happen new in someone, or it could have been inherited from a parent. And so yes, it does run in families and can go down generations, especially if it starts somewhere, but it runs in a very specific way, because you've only got 2 genes. So say it's a type where one has the change, you've got a 50-50 chance of passing it down. We know that, and we can tell you, right? And we can actually test for that in pregnancy or otherwise. So it runs in specific, very distinct patterns in families when it's monogenic or single gene or rare. And some of it can be like uncles and their nephews, because it only affects boys. It depends where the change is and what gene, what chromosome. But on the other side, which I think sometimes confuses people, is the fact that like autoimmune polygenic diseases like JIA run in families too, right? Because if you've inherited a bunch of increased risk from mum or dad, or some of your parents had some sort of autoimmune disease, you're inheriting, or you're already born with your funnel a little bit full. So it's not going to take much to tip you over. It's going to take less than the general population. So it does run in families there, but not in a predictable pattern, right? Like I showed you, that we don't know which funnels are going to be filled to which level, and we can't measure that right now. So it does run in families. You've got an increased risk, but it's not a precise number we can take. And the way that they work out the risk, because that was a question that came up again and again, what's my genetic risk for something like JIA, which is multifactorial polygenic? They do that by just population studies. So they look and they see how many people have JIA in the general population. So that's around 0.02% when I looked up the figures. And actually, there's very few papers on this. There's like a few that have been published. And the one that I found was they then took family studies, and they saw that generically in the siblings, it was around 2 to 4%. So the risk was a lot higher. That's probably the same from parent to child, is the first degree relative. And then in cousins, which are a bit more distant, there still is an increased risk, like 1%. So for JIA, if you have someone with JIA, I think Liz said that she was told that there wasn't an increased risk in her child, but there is an increased risk in your child, but it doesn't go from 0.02 to 50%. It goes from 0.02 to 4% maybe. So it's not a hugely increased risk, but there is an increased risk there, because you're sort of handing them a little bit of this polygenic risk to be born with. And then the big distinction, which again really confuses people, is that on the left, where we have genetic testing available. So all of our tests concentrate on monogenic disease. They read the sequence of the genes and they look for rare mistakes. And that's all of our clinical genetic testing. It's what you get referred to a geneticist to do, or your rheumatologist sometimes sends these tests. And so, yes, that is usually clinically available. It's not universally clinically available, as Liz mentioned. Right now, in most of the provinces, you can get some sort of genetic testing, but it will always focus on the monogenic diseases, mainly because the testing just isn't available or hasn't been developed for the polygenic multifactorial things. So you can do tests for fun where you send things off to 23andMe maybe, and they tell you, oh, you've got an increased risk of JIA maybe, but also, you can't drink coffee on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, or they'll put something else in there. We don't really rely on that. It's a bit of fun that they've taken from the literature, but there isn't a proper clinical test available. It's not to say that there never will be. Like, part of my research, and I'm happy to talk about that another time with people, is these concepts called polygenic risk scores. So can we give you a number to add up that risk so that we can be a bit more precise than just saying, oh, you've got a generic increased risk? There are some conditions where that works quite well and might become being implemented clinically. But right now, that isn't something that anyone can pay for because it doesn't exist as a clinical test. Sometimes you can see companies advertising, oh, we'll tell you if you have a increased risk of this and that. Those, I would say, are for fun. You pay, you get information. It may not be reliable type tests. Whereas clinical tests, we send them to an established lab, we get a report, we give it back to you. It's like any other medical tests that we would advise. And that can be confusing in genetics because there's a lot of companies out there that are trying to get your money and maybe even your data. So you have to be a bit careful about who you're paying and what you're getting back. And so when we take kids with rheumatic disease, right, they're going to have the symptoms that we've heard talked about already. So they're going to have things like arthritis, they're going to have things like inflammation, they're going to have things like recurrent fevers, they may have the uveitis, the eye inflammation we've talked about. And for the most part in this triangle, most of them are going to fall into one of these polygenic multifactorial disease categories. So JIA, SLE, some of these conditions that we've sort of figured out, and they'll make a diagnosis based on the symptoms, and they'll sort of group them together, and they'll have treatments, and they'll have some other tests that they can do, not genetic testing. But a little part of this huge triangle at the top are people who sort of have the same symptoms, but they have a single gene change. So, what was striking from Liz's story was like the uveitis coming on, the family history, like all of this makes us suspicious that maybe this is a rare change that's tracking in the family that is sort of hidden within this big group of JAs. So in genetics, what we kind of want to get referred and what we are trying to do is rely on the rheumatologists and the other physicians to listen to the stories. And when the story is not usual, it's unusual for a number of reasons, which I'll go through, we start thinking about doing genetic testing for the rare forms of disease, okay? And so this is how we do clinical genetic testing. So the first is, who do we test? Because we can't test everyone with JIA. We can't test everyone, like we would love to, but the resources just aren't there in any province in Canada to do that. So what we're looking for is some clues that it might be monogenic, single gene, rare. What are the clues? So the family history can help. So remember I said it runs in families, but in a particular pattern. So if every generation it's 50-50, that gives us a clue. If it's uncles to nephews, but girls don't tend to have symptoms, that gives us a clue. So certain patterns help, especially if the parents are in any way related. That also increases your risk of a single gene rare disorder because you're handing down potentially the same thing that came from a common ancestor. Or if you're from a population where there hasn't been much migration, sort of founder populations like Mennonites or Hutterites or other ones around the world. If something happens really young, so if it's like if you're seeing babies who have SLE, that's a little bit unusual, right? So we start thinking about, is it a rare form mimicking this whole big polygenic multifactorial condition? Is there a rare form that we're picking out? Anything else? So this is primarily why I'm assessing you and why I bring people in for examination and a really detailed assessment. Is there anything else in any other body system that gives you a clue to something happening with genetics? So one of the big things is there any developmental delays or issues with that that could give you a clue? And then unusual patterns or rare symptoms. So not just JIA, but JIA plus some other inflammation elsewhere, JIA plus recurrent fevers, case that we actually came through clinic today, JIA plus some sort of other weird symptom, some unusual rash that keeps on coming. These are the things that make us think, oh, hang on, this isn't typical for the normal JIA. We should start thinking about some of these rarer conditions. And then often, sometimes we get sent people who are really resistant to the standard therapy. So we know what the therapy should be now for first line and second line for things like SLE, JIA, JDM, etc. If people are just not responding for whatever reason, then maybe there is a rare cause. And like Liz said, sometimes if you get a rare cause, we can direct therapy to be more targeted, which, as Jason very astutely asked, means that we are choosing a therapy based to target the genetics that we found, or the pathway that's being disrupted. And there's a few conditions where that's being shown, and that's one of the advantages of genetic testing. So what do we practically do? We take either a buccal swab or blood test. It gets sent to the lab, the DNA gets taken out, and you do. Most provinces will start with a panel of genes. So this was the test that Liz was talking about initially. So it's actually around 600 to 700 genes that we know are to do with the immune system. So at most you'll get that. It depends which province you're in as to which one you'll do. Some local hospitals are doing it and they'll do a small panel. Some will do so the problem with the panels is that it depends where you are, if it even gets funded. Some of the 20,000 genes are tested, not all of them. You're looking for spelling mistakes in gene. It's only the monogenic disorders. It takes around 3 months to come back. And the main problem with it is it's never going to be comprehensive because we just can't keep up to date with all the new conditions coming in. So especially if it's sent to a company, they'll update their panel maybe every 1 to 2 years. And there's many new genes and disorders being discovered every month almost, lots of them in Canada as well, or with patients from Canada contributing. So we're basically chasing our tail all the time with panels. So although a panel can come back and give you a diagnosis if it's one of the known conditions for 2023, it being negative doesn't really help. It just sort of places you back on to the next step. Okay. And then when we get the results back, normally they're returned by the physician who sent them. Sometimes that's rheumatology, sometimes that's genetics. Genetic counselors sometimes return the results and explain them to you. And there's certain results that you can get from a panel. So positive is what everyone wants. I think that's what Liz was talking about. Like she was hoping for this positive. She kind of you want a diagnosis that will help you direct therapy and give you an answer for what's been going on and why this has been so unusual. And all these doctors have been telling you your child has unusual symptoms. What is it about that? What is the precise thing that's going on? But you can also get an uncertain result, and that's a maybe result. And that's because we get a change in a gene and we just haven't seen it before enough times to tell if it's affecting the gene not being working. And this was sort of also kind of mentioned by Liz in this LRBA. It wasn't a definitive diagnosis, but it was an uncertain. And then we have to go through and say, do we think it's likely or not? And sometimes there can be confusion when you get uncertain results on a report. People are like, oh, that must be it. But it really has to be looked at carefully to see if it is. And over time, they'll all get resolved because over time, we'll see those uncertain ones in healthy kids or people with the condition, and they'll move one way or the other. Sometimes we test parents if they're healthy. If it's inherited from a healthy parent, that helps. But for the most part, we just wait to see if these uncertain ones get resolved, but we give you our opinion at the time. And then it can be negative, right? And what does that mean? Does that mean my child just doesn't have a rare genetic condition? It could mean that, but there's a number of things that could mean. So why could something be negative? Well, maybe it is a gene that's not yet on the panel. Maybe it's a brand new disorder that hasn't been discovered. So it will never be on the panel until it is discovered. Maybe it's a polygenic thing. Maybe in that triangle, it was actually really a polygenic risk, and some of the conditions are like that. In which case, no matter how much genetic testing you do to look for a single gene change, you're never going to find a rare change explaining what your child has, because there's an addition of lots and lots of common changes. And also to remember, no test is perfect. Every genetic test is run by a lab. They have certain technologies. Occasionally, we've seen in older technologies that have been updated, the gene change has been found and it was just missed by the older technology. Another thing that's kind of emerging is that not all genetic changes have to be in all cells of your body. So we only test the blood or this buccal swab sample, which is from your mouth. It has a few cells. But emerging now is that there is a significant proportion of these rare autoinflammatory disorders that are sort of mosaic. So they're in some of your cells, but not all of them. They didn't happen right when a baby was created from an embryo. They happened a bit later. So some of the cells got away from it and some of the cells had it. And this is sometimes missed on the genetic test. And we're trying to figure out ways to make sure that it isn't missed. Maybe you have to take samples from other places and so on, but this could be a reason that a test is negative. So then say you are in that bucket where you're negative. We usually talk about, if you've got symptoms, I usually talk about an entity called undiagnosed systemic autoinflammatory disease, which is the SAID in CANSAID, which people were mentioning that panel. So a lot of those participants are not yet diagnosed, even in that patient group. And you embark upon what we call a diagnostic odyssey, which is the frustration which has been expressed to you by Liz very accurately and is often expressed to me every single day by many patients, because even by the time they've reached me, they've gone through a lot. And it is something that frustrates us too, and that we're trying to improve, because in genetics, we see all the rare diseases and we see how just in general, these patients have to go through a lot to get to the right person to get the right test. But once you've had the negative panel, you're usually in the realms of research. So you have to find someone who is doing research in it to be able to do that. And I've started in Calgary and started my research program. And what we do here, which I think other sites are trying to emulate eventually, or maybe we'll all get together and find a common way to do this, is that say we still have the patient, we're still suspecting it's monogenic. So it has a lot of those things. The story isn't quite right, but the panel was negative. So what can we do first off? First of all, what I've made sure is that although we're looking at the 600 genes, we actually have the data for all 20,000 genes. We just need to bring it back and look at it ourselves. And that's what Liz was talking about that we could do for Jason, is that we could bring back his data and look at all 20,000 genes. And that doesn't cost anything apart from someone to bring it back and look at it. So it's a very low cost way of doing that. And Sick Kids in Toronto are also taking this approach for a lot of their patients. And you can have an initial look at the other genes and just make sure there wasn't something in that looks suspicious in another gene that wasn't on the panel. Or you can say, oh, has there been any new disorders? And just let's check those genes too. And what we've done in Calgary is trying to make the computer or the data analysis pipeline, that's part of my research project, it was a summer student, to try and analyze that data that comes back and try and give people diagnoses. And one of the key pieces that we're missing here, which is why a lot of my patients locally have exhibited delays, is that I don't have a data analyst at the moment. We're just about to hire one to look at all. So we're at the stage where we have all this data back from all these people, but we haven't got anyone to go through systematically other than me, and one person can only do so much. And actually there's like probably a cohort of 50 to 100 people here in this pathway now, because it's very, very common that you see these cases. And so we're hoping when we do this on a research basis that we come up with a diagnosis, and that's our hope. But there's a chance that when we look at all the other genes, like even when we look at all 20,000, we also don't find anything, in which case we have got one more trick up our sleeve, which is again research, and it's called whole genome sequencing. So this thing to look at all the other genes is called whole exome, because it just looks at the genes. The whole genome looks at the whole genetics from start to finish. So all the genes, all the in-between bits that control genes, anything that might be swapped or having structural things. Like, it's the biggest test that we have. We're hoping one day it will be available clinically, but for now it's a research test. what was mentioned was that we recently lost access to that for a little while whilst one study closed, and I'm trying to open another study, but you need to find a study that has whole genome sequencing. And again, at the moment, Toronto and Sick Kids I know has it, but some other centers maybe as well. But that may also not be the answer, right? So when you do whole genome sequencing, you can imagine you're checking the whole genome from start to finish. Imagine the number of changes that could possibly be the answer in various genes. There's just so many, and you have to somehow narrow it down. And so the way we are thinking about doing that in Calgary, another thing that we're setting up is these functional tests. So when you get genes, DNA, it gets switched to RNA, and then it gets switched to a protein. Can we formulate a system where this all becomes comprehensive, that we're doing the genetics, but we're also doing a whole bunch of RNA work and a whole bunch of protein work, and we're putting it all together to try and make the diagnosis for these cases that are super difficult to solve. So as we're going down the research pathway, we're getting to the people who are undiagnosed, who are going through their diagnostic odyssey for many years. And yeah, they're getting to the end eventually, but it's taking a while because you have to do lots and lots of things to try and figure them out. And so in Calgary, at least, what we're trying to set up is that a patient comes in, if they've had the clinical genome test and it's got an uncertain variant or gene of uncertain variant that I mentioned before, we take samples, we store them in a biobank, we then switch them to a functional lab that we just got funding to set up. So another PhD scientist here, Dr. Tim Schutt. Then we can run all these different tests to try and resolve things. And there's things that look at RNA, there's things that look at protein, there's things that look at all sorts of things. Then we sort of combine that data and try and bring out a diagnosis. It may be that even sometimes we get to a diagnosis straight away for an individual patient, but it could be that we just get a gene and then we need to do further work. We need to find other families around the world with the same gene that has the same change. We then need to do research on the cohort, then it becomes a condition, then it gets onto the clinical panel and lots more people are diagnosed. That's traditionally how things have happened, and that's why it takes so long. It's not something that's easy to do, and each genetic condition that's established, even when I was at Sick Kids, we worked on one together, and it took 5 years to get from start to finish with this patient to even publishing just him. So it was like a long journey to get all the research done. So another question, and this is my final slide because I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. I was told I was allowed to take some liberties there, but please stop me if I'm going way beyond. But essentially, how can we advocate? And I think we wrote this grant with Cassie and friends, which wasn't funded, unfortunately. It's for the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. But as part of that, we did establish this CAN-SAID advisory council that has remained. And we're hoping that with that, we did contact lots of specialist rheumatologists from across the country who all had a specialist interest in these rare autoinflammatory diseases. And we were hoping that at some point we're going to get together and work out a pathway for everyone so that everyone across Canada can somehow enter a study. But there aren't funding mechanisms for that in Canada. So we need the patient voice. We need people to say, we need this. The government and their agencies, their research agencies need to support this kind of research. And it needs to have a strong patient voice at its center saying, we need this. We need access to genetic testing. When it's negative, we need access to all the research to figure out our children, to give them a diagnosis. And the reason is for this, this, and this, and tell your story and sort of use that as your power to enact some change. And we're still hoping that, as a group of people interested from all over the country, you may recognize some of your rheumatologists here, that we can get together and do this eventually, but we need to find another way to do it. And we're all kind of working on that independently to see where can we get funding to have this happen. And so I'll stop there. I'm sorry if I went a bit over time, and I'll let us move into the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Maraha, for your presentation. It's just so helpful for patients and parents to have these opportunities to learn more about the world of genetics and the work that is going on in this space. I know for our journey, as Dr. Maruha said, it can take a long time to discover what might be going on at the gene level, especially if previous genetic testing keeps coming back negative. I appreciate how important it is to elevate the patient voice, as Dr. Maruha said, share the stories and the lived experiences to push change and drive research agendas. So thank you. This is also a great opportunity because now we have a Q&A. We're going to segue into our question and answer portion, and there might be some questions that still remain unanswered. Before I open up into questions, I just wanted to introduce Dr. Marinka Twilt. She is going to be here to answer some questions that you may have as well. Dr. Twilt is a pediatric rheumatologist based out of the Alberta Children's Hospital. And we have, our family has another connection. Dr. Twilt is my son's doctor. So we're very grateful to have all of her support as we navigate my son's illness. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
So question, just a reminder, you can put your question in the chat and we will monitor them, and we'll work our way through all the questions that have come in. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, maybe I can start with one question I saw sort of like coming around on the chat when I was listening to Ash, which is the different autoimmune diseases that sometimes are seen in the family. And I think Ash sort of like alluded to that as well, that sometimes it's multiple factors, and some of the autoimmune diseases have some common factors. So if that funnel is full already with common factors, that might be for one autoimmune disease, but might also be for the other autoimmune disease, such as, for instance, celiac disease. We see a lot in patients that also have juvenile arthritis or another autoimmune disease, and also thyroid disease. So it is more common to have other autoimmune diseases in patients where autoimmune diseases are present in the family. So that was one of the questions that was in a chat. I don't know, Ash, if you want to maybe more eloquently answer the question than my non-genetic answer.
No, I think you're right. The genetic risk is shared. So celiac and type 1 diabetes, you tend to see certain autoimmune things go together a lot. But having said that, when I see a pattern that is unusual, I'll sometimes think, is there a rare genetic condition causing autoimmune disease? So there is a few patterns that are sufficiently unusual, and like in that pattern of every generation there's 50-50, then I would say, well, then maybe I'll think again. And there are a few rare monogenic conditions that cause multiple autoimmune disease as well. LRBA that we have been mentioned is one of them. So you can get type 1 diabetes, stuff with arthritis, like lots and lots of different things. So that's another tricky one, is that normally autoimmune is all polygenic, but in a very small proportion there is like some rare monogenic, and we need to try and figure out who those are. And it's again about the pattern and it being unusual. So if Marinka say didn't see this pattern, or there was like 5 in a single person from very early age, then we should be thinking about, let's do some more genetics in that person.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll go to the next question. Dr. Maruha, you kind of touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but I'll get right to the point. We have a question: who pays for genetic testing?
So for the clinical testing, the province will pay. It depends on where you are in Canada. So the province should pay. I know Liz said that she paid for her genetic testing, and I apologize to her for that she had to do that because it turned out that we could have done what she wanted on a research basis, which is a communication issue on our part. So you shouldn't have to pay for the clinical panel. It should be available somewhere. Beyond that, the research testing usually is funded by a research study, but some people get frustrated with that timeline, right? Like 1 year, 2 years, they're into that. So there are people who are offering that whole genome test where you can pay for it. There are companies where you can do that. There are some geneticists, somewhat not seen as a bit rogue by the rest of us as people who offer like private services. Like private services in Canada is a bit of a hot button issue at the moment. So we should really be not asking patients and parents to pay for their own testing, but there is a way to get that done. The one proviso for that is if you're going to self-pay, really make sure that you're going to a company that would have been used otherwise for a clinical test, right? Because there's lots of people out there who are trying to get your money and they advertise online, and what you get back might not be the right information. So hate to mention 23andMe again, but if you're going to pay for 23andMe and think it's going to give you the diagnosis, you need to take that with a pinch of salt. It may give you some clues, but we would repeat all of their testing and do it on a clinical basis before we take any of that, because we see that as a fun test to tell you where you're from, even though that's not particularly accurate. So you have to kind of think about that as well, right? So what is the test reputable? So if you are private paying, and because you're fed up with going through things, which I appreciate can happen, it's often good to get in touch with a geneticist at least, or your clinician, and say, if I am going to pay for something, where would you have sent it to if you could have, or where would, like, can I just go to that same place and pay? And you will get it quicker for sure if you do that, because say the whole genome is only research, but you can pay to get it done and you'll get your data back. The other issue we come across is that when that happens, they sometimes then come to us and say, can you just interpret this for us? And it depends on where it was sent and what you're getting back. So again, if you private pay, and I've said this to some people recently, make sure you get everything back. Make sure you get your report, you get your data on a USB, you get everything back, so that if then you're engaging again with the clinical system here in Canada with a doctor or geneticist, you can take that information and they can look again. Because as I said, 20,000 genes, 5,000 for now. In a few years' time, there may be many new conditions. You can go back and look again at the same data if you've had the test, and or we can plug it into our research pathway. So it's worth getting your money's worth if you are going to pay for testing. But say for a whole genome, to pay privately can be up to $10,000 because you do 3 people, the person and their 2 parents.
Thank you, Dr. Marwaha. Dr. Twilt, I'll direct this question to you. What does the research show about PAPA lasting into adulthood, as is the case for our daughter?
Yeah, so I think PFAPA is one of those diseases that, you know, one thing I think we need to, I don't remember if Ash has actually mentioned this in his presentation, but we have to remember these autoinflammatory diseases are very new to all of us. So the first gene was described in 1997, which was the FMF gene. And since then, there are more and more genes that we every year are being discovered, right? So it's really sort of like a new era in rheumatology. So it's we don't know that much about these diseases as we know from some of the other diseases, as juvenile arthritis, which we know much longer things about. So PFAP is one of these diseases, which is a little bit of let's say it a little diplomatic. It's a little bit of a pile of probably a lot of different diseases that are all put together, because we have PFAPA patients that have the real PFAPA classification, but a lot of patients we call incomplete PFAPA, or have PFAPA with 1 or 2 characters, which probably shouldn't be called PFAPA, but should just be called, syndrome of unknown recurrent fevers or systemic autoinflammatory disease, because we don't know exactly what it is. And I think if you have the classical PFAPA patients, it seems that they most of the time grow out of it. But as I said, these diseases we know for like 20, 25 years. So some of the patients that were 3-4 years old now are now 24, right? So we're now starting to see that not all of the patients grow out of it. And some patients are older when they actually present with PFAPA-like features. And I think in the coming years, we'll learn a lot about these diseases. There's lots of international research and collaboration ongoing to look for sort of like either genes, because PFAPA is one of those more polygenic genes, polygenic diseases, than the real autoinflammatory monogenic diseases, as far as we know. So I don't have a good answer for that, but there is more and more evidence, I think more and more coming in the years. Ash, I don't know if you want to comment anything else.
the only plug I would say is that in that circle I showed was all the pediatric rheumatologists. It was a pediatric study we were proposing, but emerging now are adult specialists in rheumatology or genetics across the country that are looking at adults that present with the same things. And so in Canada, we're actually a little bit further ahead with that. At least in Calgary, in Toronto, there's a specialist adult rheumatologist now. In Vancouver, there's someone who does adult immunology. So that we're probably going to need an equivalent circle for the adult people, bring them in to be able to answer some of those questions, because we just have no data on that. There's so few patients that have gone into adulthood that we can answer that correctly, right, on a systematic way.
Great, thank you. This might be a question for both of you. Is it typically for these family of diseases, is it typically always a rheumatologist that is ordering the genetic testing, or might there be other doctors that order genetic testing?
It's probably depending a little bit on the province and the hospital. So in our case, we usually do it sort of like together. So usually I put it in and then say to Ash if I have like a strong feeling it is a certain disease and I want it really quickly, or if it's more like, sometimes she also do it just to take off that it's not, because you think it's not, but you just want to make sure it's not. So then you want to click it specifically for FMF, for instance, you want to click off it's not FMF so that that. But there are other provinces where you can also have an immunologist or an infectious disease specialist who sees patients specifically with periodic fever syndrome. So it might be that they either go to geneticist or they might actually order it immediately themselves. I know that some of my pediatric rheumatology colleagues also sometimes started genetic testing and then go back to the geneticist if they have any questions about the results, because although I can read the report like everybody else, it's something different to understand all these variants of unknown significance and things like that. And that's why I love to do it together with Ash, because we both bring our own view and our own specialty to the discussion. And I think that brings the rich, the sort of better view on it than if you do it in silos, because I think we both see something different sometimes.
Yeah, and for patients, and if you want to advocate, I would say go to whoever can order it the quickest for you. Because genetic wait lists can sometimes be 2 years. You don't want to be waiting for that. If the rheumatologist can order your panel, we see people a lot quicker with results. So especially if there is a result to discuss, right? So find out, ask your rheumatologist, ask your immunologist, ask them if they can, ask even your pediatrician, can you order this panel? And if it's something comes, then make a referral to genetics or have it cooking whilst that's going on, and then update them with a result. So try and just get that initial foot in your door as quickly as possible. And then we will all look at the results together, ideally, right? Even in Calgary, try and do it actually together with pediatrics like rheumatology, immunology, and we have rounds discussions and so on. But in other places, even you could go to each person individually, and eventually you would see a geneticist and they would explain their opinion and so on, right? So so just try and get whoever in your province has the ability to order panels, get them to do it. And panels are not hugely restricted, but in some provinces they are.
Okay, thank you. This goes back to paying for genetic testing, this question. It says, what about for patients who have a rheumatologist that's in a different province than where you live and where your health insurance is? Do you have any insight on how genetic testing is paid for in that situation?
It usually comes under your health card if the province is paying. So it's where your health card is based. Like we sometimes see people from BC and Saskatchewan on the border, but we charge their provinces, and each province has its own rules about genetic testing. So you can see a doctor from another province, but they will have to go back to your province's health regulations to get the funding. And as you can imagine, some provinces just don't have any, some don't even have a geneticist. So it can be difficult in some places to navigate that, which is why it would be ideal for us to form some sort of national network, because with the research testing, we can sort of we can fill in the gaps of people who can't get the panels. We can actually offer them something through a research network, because then you just need to be linked into the network through someone, and it'll be done somewhere. So that's one of the things that came out, especially from the BC doctors, is that with a good research infrastructure in Canada, we will be able to replace clinical testing that people can't find or can't get easily with a research test that they can perhaps at least link in, even with directly enrolling in a research study.
Okay, thank you. We're still on genetics. Are there genetic relations to JIA or rheumatic diseases and blood disorders? We have 3 generations of arthritis in our family.
Yeah, so I think that was a multi-level question in terms of, and I think there was some other questions about JIA. We talked about JIA and autoimmune conditions, but so in the immune system, all your cells are in the blood. So there are some blood disorder, like when there's a genetic problem with cells in the blood in the immune system, there can be other blood disorders, right, that overlap. So that's the link there, is that JIA is an immune problem and the immune cells are circulating in your blood. So sometimes when you have a problem with a blood cell, it can cause other blood cell problems. So that there can be overlap, but it's a bit difficult without knowing the exact blood disorder, whether there is a link between that individual case and the JIA, or whether it's 2 separate things.
Thank you. Okay. Another genetic test or question. Are we close to gene therapy treatment for some of these diseases with clear genetic markers?
I would say yes, we're close. But yeah, so I can talk about my experience there. So in Calgary, we're starting up Canada's first gene therapy trial. It's for not a rheumatic disease, an immune disease called severe combined immunodeficiency. Babies are born without an immune system and they need a transplant anyway. We're going to take the cells from that baby, correct the gene defect, and put them back in. And that approach, once it's established, being established for a few diseases now, of which Calgary will be the first. We just got funded to do this big grant to do that. Once the proof of principle is established, you should be able to apply it to other diseases. The problem is that all the genetic changes are individual, right? So you will need a way to personalize that to your child's specific genetic change, taking out the cells, fixing it, and putting the cells back in. So that's probably the closest one that we're doing, and it is happening in Canada right now. And there's a great immunologist in Calgary, and Dr. Nikki Wright, who's driving this effort. And part of the effort is we in Canada need to get gene therapy funded by the government, because companies are not going to be interested in the 3 or 4 children in the world with this condition. And we need to develop all the infrastructure and the way that we can take out do the gene editing piece. So I think it is an exciting time. I think it will be within our lifetime, like within the lifetime of a child growing up, for sure. But there's barriers that need to be overcome. So yeah, gene therapy is progressing. It's progressing in Canada and in Calgary in particular. And we hope that that's the start of the government, both the provincial government and the national government, saying that we need to concentrate on gene therapy for people with rare diseases. And there's other efforts across the country to make this a priority for government too.
Wow, thank you. I have a question for Dr. Twilt. So if your child has a diagnosis of JIA and is receiving treatment but is somewhat resistant, what is the threshold for pursuing genetic testing? Is there any clinical benefit if they are already receiving some treatment and being followed by a rheumatologist?
That's a great question. I think this is really something to discuss with your rheumatologist. Unfortunately, like juvenile arthritis sometimes can be difficult to treat. So normal JIA, not JIA with a genetic background. So I think discussing it with your rheumatologist is always a good idea. JIA is one of our more common rare diseases, so it's not like 1 in a million, but like actually quite a lot of kids have juvenile arthritis, unfortunately. But it's in another way good, because that means we as rheumatologists really see a lot of juvenile arthritis, so we have a much better feeling with juvenile arthritis what is in the realm of normal, not like responding to treatment and you just have to up the treatment, and what is like outside of normal, and you really have to start to think like, how can it be that this patient is not reacting so well to the medication, and do we have to think of something else? So this is something where if you have any concerns, then just talk to your rheumatologist, and they will honestly tell you if this is what they see, you know, in a lot of other children with juvenile arthritis, or if they say, well, now that you mention it, it might be something that is a little different and maybe we should explore other pathways. But unfortunately, the treatments for juvenile arthritis have evolved significantly in the last 20 years, but there's still patients who do not always react to the first treatment that is started. And the other inflammatory patients, including yourself, Sarah, know that it's trial and error for lots of these diseases. So sometimes you just start with the wrong medication and then we have to try another one. And this is where we hope with the genetics that you know the pathway, and then you can do that tailored treatment that Liz was talking about as well, the really personalized treatment. And that's what we would hope to have for everybody. And there are quite some studies ongoing also in juvenile arthritis to really look at that biological background that we hopefully can do more targeted treatment. And one of those studies is the UCAN study that is running throughout the country and is really looking at new patients, but also if patients stop medication or start medication, if we can predict who does well. So hopefully that will help in the next coming years as well to give some answers.
Great, thank you, Dr. Twilt. This is for both you and Dr. Maraha. This question is just curious about any new research that can point to any triggers that cause CRMO, SJIA, JDM, or genetic studies that explain which genes are responsible.
That's a great question. So all of these diseases are polygenic diseases. None of these have like one gene, unless CRMO can be part of another condition where there is a gene. But if it's the CRMO, then most of the time it's not just one gene that is involved. So there is for sure research ongoing. One is that we have multiple registries. We have a registry both in Canada, which is for patients with JIA, but we also have a registry in North America called CARA, where we have JDM patients, lupus patients, JIA patients. And this is what we need. And also CRMO patients are in there as well, because these diseases are not common. So if we want to find something, we need to do multi-center, multinational research, because with 1 or 2 patients, you can't find out what are potential triggers. It's always good to ask in your center if you are able to contribute to a study. Many of the Canadian centers are part of one or multiple of these registries, and are more than happy to connect you and make you part of the registry so that your information can be captured and can help with all the other information to lead to a better understanding of these diseases. So please reach out to your rheumatologist if you would like, and then they can let you know if there is something. There are some organizations that have patients portals, like the Data2 organization has a patient portal as well. So there are some that you can, like, yourself sort of like make known to the researchers that you would be interested to be part of potential future studies.
And yeah, I would echo that like we were talking about the polygenic being on the right and the monogenic on the left on that triangle slide, those conditions are thought to be polygenic. And remember, I said that clinical genetic testing will never give you the answer for that, because there's a number of different small risk things, and we just don't have a good genetic test that's clinically available to. Maybe in the future, when all this research comes around, we can figure out a score where we add up all the little changes and give you a score. But for now, genetic testing is probably not going to help you there. And these other strategies that Marinka was talking about, really collecting the patients, trial and error a little bit with treatment, learning from other people with these sort of rarer but polygenic entities is the way forward.
Thank you. This is a question for both of you. Do you think in the future, stem cells can be used to treat autoimmune diseases? I do have my daughter's cord blood stored. She is 9 years old with lupus and arthritis.
So, I mean, stem cell transplantations have been used and are used in some of the rheumatic diseases. It's not the cure for all though. So it's mostly used in really refractory cases because there are quite some side effects of like regular stem cell transplant. I mean, there's different forms of stem cell transplant, and that's too much to go in here, but you can give your own blood cells back, you can give blood cells of somebody else back, and there's risk associated with the different ways of how you do stem cell transplant. I personally think there's more hopefully more with either gene treatment, but if it's like polygenic, that's probably very difficult to do. But hopefully we can identify pathways better for these polygenic diseases. As I said, that's why some of these studies are so important, because if we know from the start what pathway, most of the juvenile arthritis patients, you're either treated with like a TNF alpha drug, or you're treated with a anti-IL-17 drug, or with a JAK-STAT inhibitor, and it's trial and error at this moment. We don't know who will succeed with what drug, and if we could like predict that, that would actually lead to sort of like personalized treatment as well. And I think that has a higher likelihood of being the future than stem cell transplant, because it has been done specifically in Europe. There has been trials in juvenile arthritis, but sometimes it comes back as well after stem cell transplant.
Yeah, and it's quite a big thing to take out someone's immune system and even put in their own immune system back is a big effort. It's like a huge undertaking with side effects and risks. And therefore, I think, you know, I'm talking about other autoimmune diseases because one of the other things I work on is diabetes. Yes, it works in diabetes, but it's just too much to put people through when there's insulin. And they start thinking about, are there other things like maybe a medication or like the Humira treatment or other targeted antibodies that can affect a particular pathway? It's not taking out the whole immune system, it's like adjusting it slightly, and that might be what you need. And then in terms of should you store cord blood, so it would be useful if you had cord blood from someone and there was a single gene disorder and you wanted to do the gene therapy. That's a different kettle of fish, which is what we're trying in Calgary. But often it's better to store cord blood from a sibling who's healthy, because a sibling matched donor is probably what they're going to want to use. Rarely do they want to give you back your own immune cells unless there's some way of correcting something, which is just emerging. So yeah, it is useful sometimes to store cord blood for kids, because it's kind of an easy thing to do, to be honest. But it might be like you have a sibling there, and then they don't have to go through, if there is ever a need for cells for whatever reason, it could be for a cancer in the future, right? The cells are there rather than having to take them out of a sibling or someone else.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this is for Dr. Maraha and Dr. Twilt. What advice do you give to patients who have some of these rare diseases when they are thinking of starting a family? Do they need to have genetic testing done to be making an informed choice?
Yep. So if it's a monogenic disorder, you're suspicious for that, we do try and get that done before someone expands their family, because if we have a result, you could technically test in a pregnancy. And if you are pregnant and waiting for your genetics appointment, you should tell the genetics clinic that you're pregnant, because we will speed everything up for sure. Having said that, with the polygenic risk that we were talking about, which is the majority of people and the majority of cases, there is a risk, right? But it goes from 0.02 to 4%. Like, flip that on its head. It's 96% that it won't happen, right? So with that sort of case, yes, that you do have an increased risk for your next child, but I wouldn't say that should affect your decision to have more children and thinking that this will happen again and so on. So like there's two sides of that coin. I always try and take those risk numbers and flip them on their head, because there's 96% chance that everything's going to be fine and you're not going to have another child with the same condition if it's something like JIA. And that sometimes reassures people and gives them confidence that they don't need to have all this done before they can be confident that they're going to expand their family. But yeah, just with that caveat that if you are under sort of suspicion of a single gene disorder and waiting genetic test on a wait list, and you happen to become pregnant, like let the clinic know, we'll bring you in and we'll do things a lot more quickly. That side of our service is a lot more quicker and efficient than the children's side, which unfortunately has a bit longer wait lists.
Okay, thank you. Well, this will be our last question. That went by quickly, didn't it? So this is for all three of you. How can we advocate for children, more access to drugs and research for kids with JIA? And how do we help kids that have multiple autoimmune diseases such as JIA and Crohn's? So what kind of work can we do to help?
So I think it's always good to talk to your rheumatologist to ask what can you do, because I mean, I think there's, as I said, there's quite some national/international registries that I think is easy. It's like usually non-invasive, which means there's no blood test or anything else that is associated to it. And it's just clinical information and questionnaires usually that are needed. And it can really help. It really has helped in the past already with answering some of these questions, as in like, are there certain triggers or not? So I think being open to, be part of research and also be part of research that sometimes seems to be more invasive. I was talking about the UCAN study that needs blood samples. And I know that sometimes it feels really a burden, and it feels like hard to do that if your child is young, but it might not even help at that moment your child, but it might help somebody else who's diagnosed in 2 years from now. So I think just to, and it doesn't mean that I'm forcing you all to do this, but just to think about it and just think if you would be willing to contribute to research. I think that is, if we want to move the field forward, we have to do research. We cannot move forward in this field without doing research, and it needs to be collaborative research, because as I said, these diseases are too rare to do it in silos in the different centers. That would be my my one advocate, and then I'll leave to Liz and Ash to add something.
Well, I think for me, as a parent, just being involved with like a bigger organization, obviously I talked to our rheumatology clinic who put us in touch with Cassie and friends, because I had spent months and months like in a rabbit hole of like discussing it with politicians and just not getting anywhere. And it's a huge burden as a parent, and you just don't get anywhere. And like with the citrate-free Humira, there were so many roadblocks. It's like it's approved, but it's not funded. And it's so much more than what, there's so many more layers to it than parents know until you've started getting into that. And, like I was really excited when citrate-free Humira was approved, but then it was like, oh, actually it's approved, but in this province because they agreed to funding and this province hasn't. And, we had come from the US where, I was like, well, I'm just going to go pick it up in the US and bring it back. And you can't do that. So I think we feel often helpless as parents, but knowing that not having to do it alone and being part of an organization to get things done. Like I didn't see any movement until I was working with a team of people that knew who to go through and what steps to go through and stuff. It's really hard to make change alone, but I feel like we have a really big community. And with this big community, if we have people participating and we're working together, I think we can advocate for change and advocate for better for our kids.
And I think I would just add briefly to echo that. I think there's two means of advocacy for your own child going through their diagnostic journey. In that sort of advocacy, you need a quarterback. Sometimes that can be you because you can take that on. Sometimes that needs to be a pediatrician who you get along with and who is willing to go do that for you. So you have to find that person somewhere. It could be a family member, support member, but someone needs to be your quarterback and needs to, as Liz was touching on earlier as well, like really push all these physicians who are taking care of your child to start working together and communicate properly and tell you what's going on. And if that's not happening and you see that not happening, don't feel afraid to pick up the phone and ring a clinic and being like, what's happening with my child and what's happening here? I don't understand, or can I have an appointment to discuss this? And often that can be someone else doing that on your behalf as well. And then just another side of advocacy is like in general for the field, and both for JIA and autoimmune diseases and for rare autoinflammatory diseases, there is power in numbers. The grant that was not funded talked about that a lot, that, although all these people have their conditions, and we're going to move into breakout rooms with people's conditions, there's a huge chunk that are undiagnosed, which don't fall into any of those categories, but there needs to be a way to bring all these people together. And so the legacy of that grant that wasn't funded was the CanSAID Council, which I know Sarah is part of. There's other members here and they'll be in the breakout rooms, but they're working to pull together a group of people to enact change and enact change on a government level to provide both clinical and research testing across Canada. And that's kind of, I think, where it will emerge. So if you want to be a great way to advocate is to go through organizations like Cassie and Friends. There's also other ones that have started up online. There's ones in the States too, which take on Canadian patients. So there's a lot of efforts there that you could join to get this sort of power in numbers and this stronger, larger patient voice. Because, for example, I take type 1 diabetes. They have lots of funding, a great organization, a great charity. They direct a lot of research in Canada. They have lots of money. It's because of the amount of patients there, together. So in our field, because everything's rare, everyone has slightly different things, we still all need to come together under this banner and have that voice be united.